The land deed trembled in Henrietta Kendrick's hands, not because of the Kansas wind that swept across the open plain, but because she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was about to make either the bravest or the most foolish decision of her 32 years on this earth. She stood at the edge of what the land office clerk in Dodge City had called with barely concealed amusement, the Kendrick parcel, a stretch of cracked, sun-baked ground that sat between the limestone bluffs to the north, and a creek bed that the clerk had assured her ran dry every summer without fail. The grass was sparse and yellowed. The soil, where she knelt and dug her fingers into it, was hard as fired clay. A single cottonwood tree leaned at a desperate angle near the southern boundary, as though it had been trying to walk away from this place for years and simply lacked the legs to finish the job. Behind her, the wagon creaked as her 3 children shifted their weight. "Mama," said her eldest, Clara, who was 11 years old and possessed of her late father's unnerving tendency to state the obvious with perfect seriousness, "it does not look like much." "No," Henrietta agreed, brushing the dirt from her fingers and rising to her full height. She was not a tall woman, but she had the kind of posture that made people think she was. Her dark hair, streaked now with a few threads of silver that had arrived in the 2 years since Thomas Kendrick had been laid in the ground outside of St. Louis, was pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. "It does not look like much at all." "Then why are we here?" asked her son, George, who was 8 and had spent most of the 2-week journey from Missouri loudly expressing his opinion that the entire venture was unnecessary. "Because it is ours," Henrietta said, and there was a quiet finality in her voice that settled the matter as effectively as any argument she could have made. The youngest, a 6-year-old girl named Me, said nothing. She simply climbed down from the wagon, walked to the leaning cottonwood, and pressed her small palm flat against its bark as though greeting an old friend. Me had always been the most accepting of the 3. The year was 1873, and Kansas was a place of contradictions. The cattle drives that had made Dodge City famous were in full swing, churning money and dust and trouble in equal measure through the streets of every town along the trail. Homestead claims were being filed at a furious pace as families from the east poured westward, drawn by the promise of 160 acres of free land under the Homestead Act, which had been law for 11 years now but had not yet run out of takers. Most of those families, however, chose land near water, land with good grass, land that other people also wanted, because the wanting of it was usually a sign that it was worth having. The Kendrick parcel, it seemed, no one had wanted. The land office clerk had told Henrietta this, not unkindly, but with the blunt honesty of a man who had watched too many hopeful settlers return broken and hollow-eyed. "That particular piece, ma'am, has been passed over 14 times in 3 years, he had said. 14 separate individuals looked at it and filed on something else instead. Then it will be available, Henrietta had said, and had signed the papers. She had $112 to her name. She had the wagon, 2 mules named Henry and Absalom, a milk cow called Prudence, 4 laying hens, a cast-iron stove she intended to die before she parted with, a crate of seeds, a small arsenal of hand tools, enough flour and salt pork to last 6 weeks, and the unshakable conviction that she would make something of this land or she would make something of herself trying. Thomas had left her nothing but debts and grief. The debts she had settled by selling everything in their rented house in St. Louis. The grief she had carried west with her like a stone in her pocket, heavy but familiar, something she had grown accustomed to the weight of. They camped that first night beneath the leaning cottonwood, all 4 of them wrapped in quilts around a small fire, the stars overhead so thick and bright they seemed almost loud. Henrietta lay on her back after the children slept and stared up at them for a long time, thinking about the particular silence of a place where no one else lived. It was not the comfortable silence of a house after children have gone to bed. It was something larger and older, a silence with dimensions to it, with distance built inside it. She found, to her surprise, that she did not find it frightening. She found it clarifying. She was up before dawn, walking the perimeter of her land with the deed in her hand, matching the written measurements to the physical world as best she could. The boundary to the east was marked by a line of stones that someone, long ago, had set in the ground with purpose, and as she followed this line north she became aware, gradually, of the fact that she was not alone. There was a horse. A very good horse, a tall roan with a white star on its forehead, standing on the other side of the stone line and watching her with calm, intelligent eyes. And sitting on the ground beside that horse, with his back against a fence post and his hat pulled low over his face, was a man. He was asleep. Henrietta studied him for a moment. He was long in the leg, broad in the shoulder, and dressed in the worn but well-maintained clothing of a man who worked with his hands and expected his clothing to do the same. His boots were good. His hat, even tipped over his face, was the hat of a man who had earned it honestly. A bedroll was tied behind his saddle. A rifle rested against the fence post within easy reach of his right hand. "Excuse me," she said. The hat tilted back. One eye opened, then the other. He looked at her from underneath the brim with the unhurried assessment of a man who woke up in unfamiliar circumstances often enough that he had learned not to panic about it. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 31, with a jaw that needed the attention of a razor, and eyes the color of good creek water when the sun hit it just right, a sort of clear, deep hazel that read differently depending on the light. There were fine lines at the corners of those eyes from squinting into too many western horizons, and his nose had been broken at least once and set not quite straight. He was, she thought with a detached sort of fairness, a handsome man in the rough and unfinished way that this country seemed to produce men. "Morning," he said. His voice was unhurried too, low and easy like water moving through a shallow bed. "You are on my land," Henrietta said. He sat up a little straighter, pushed his hat back, and looked around at the flat expanse of Kansas with an expression that suggested he found this claim moderately interesting. "Your land," he said. "The Kendrick parcel. I filed the claim 3 days ago in Dodge City. My name is Henrietta Kendrick." She held the deed out as though intending to show it to him across the stone line. He rose from the ground in a single, unhurried motion that spoke of a body accustomed to outdoor sleeping and came to the stone line and looked at the deed. He did not take it from her. He simply read it where it was. "Levi Keene," he said, extending his hand across the stones. "I ranch the land directly east of yours. Been sleeping against this fence post because my roof blew off 2 days ago and I have not yet gotten around to fixing it." She looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. His grip was firm and brief and honest. "Your roof blew off," she repeated. "We had a considerable wind." "I see." She looked past him east and could just make out through the early morning haze what appeared to be a low structure of rough-cut limestone with a gaping absence where a roof should have been. "And you sleep outside rather than repair it." "I was going to repair it," he said, with a slight shift in his expression that suggested he was mildly embarrassed and had no particular intention of showing it, "after I slept." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Henrietta found this noteworthy. "Well," she said, tucking the deed back into her coat, "you are welcome to sleep on your side of the line." "Much obliged," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile or might have been the wind. She turned and walked back to her cottonwood, and did not look back, but she was aware, in the way that a person is aware of things they are making an effort not to be aware of, that he watched her go. The first weeks on the Kendrick parcel were a sustained education in the difference between difficulty and impossibility. Henrietta had always understood in an abstract way that homesteading was hard. She had not understood, in the specific and physical way that only doing a thing can teach you, exactly what the particular hardness of it felt like in the muscles of her back at the end of a day, or in the skin of her hands, or in the particular quality of exhaustion that settled over her each night, different from any tiredness she had known before, deeper and more thorough. She and Clara and George, with me providing enthusiastic if not always useful assistance, set to work. The first order of business was shelter, because June was already hot and July would be worse, and then came August, and Henrietta had heard enough about Kansas summers to take them seriously. The original structure she had envisioned building, a modest sod house dug into the gentle rise at the north end of the property, proved more complicated than her reading on the subject had suggested. The sod cutter she had borrowed from the land office broke on the second day, its blade defeated by the clay-heavy soil that made the Kendrick parcel so unappealing to farmers. She stood over the broken tool with her hands on her hips and did the arithmetic of her situation in her head. She could ride to Dodge City for a new blade, which would take most of a day and cost money she did not want to spend. She could try to repair the broken one, which she doubted she had the skills for. Or she could find another solution. She was still doing this arithmetic when she heard a wagon coming from the east. Levi Keene pulled up at the stone line with a load of cut limestone in the wagon bed and a sod cutter that was not broken balanced on top of it. He climbed down and lifted the sod cutter over the fence line without ceremony. "I heard your blade go," he said. "Sound carries out here." Henrietta looked at him, then at the sod cutter, then back at him. "I cannot pay you for this," she said. "Not right now." "I did not ask for payment," he said. "I am not a charity case, Mr. Keene." "No," he agreed in a tone that suggested he had assessed this and found it accurate. "You are not. Think of it as a loan of the tool, then. You can return it when you are done with it." She wanted to argue further. She was aware, in a clear-eyed way, that the argument would be a point of pride rather than a point of practicality, and that pride was something she could not afford to spend too freely on the Kendrick parcel. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, and then, without being asked, he began unloading the limestone from his wagon. "What is that for?" she asked. "Your walls," he said. "Sod is good enough for a lot of things, but your soil is going to give you trouble. Limestone cuts clean out here if you know where to look, and I know where to look. Foundation and walls of limestone will last longer anyway." She stood and watched him stack the stone beside the rise and tried to decide how she felt about this. She settled on cautiously grateful, which felt appropriate to the situation. George appeared from behind the wagon where he had been feeding Prudence the milk cow and stared at Levi with the frank and unself-conscious assessment of an 8-year-old boy. "Are you a real cowboy?" he demanded. Levi looked at him. "I run cattle," he said. "I suppose that qualifies. Do you have a gun?" "George," Henrietta said. "Yes," Levi said, and George's face split into an expression of profound satisfaction, as though this answered every important question. Clara emerged next, precise and watchful, and stood at her mother's elbow. "He was sleeping against the fence post the other morning," she informed her mother, as though this were useful intelligence. "I know," Henrietta said. "His roof blew off," Clara continued. "I am aware. Has he fixed it yet?" "I have," Levi said, and there was definite amusement in his voice now. A warmth that had not been there in their first conversation, and that Henrietta noticed in the way you notice a fire when you have been cold. Me appeared last, as she usually did, from somewhere unexpected, in this case from behind the leaning cottonwood, carrying a fistful of wildflowers that she offered to Levi with great solemnity. He accepted them with equal solemnity, and tucked one into the band of his hat, and me looked at him with an expression of utter and complete approval. Henrietta watched all of this and said nothing, but something shifted in her chest, quiet and tentative, like a seed cracking open underground where no one could see it yet. The building of the house took 3 weeks, and Levi Keene was there for most of them. He was not always there in an obvious way. He did not arrive every morning with tools and instructions and the air of a man taking over. He came and went, attending to his own work, which was considerable, since he ran a small herd of cattle and kept a vegetable patch, and was in the process of adding a corral to his property. But he appeared with useful frequency, often at the exact moment when a particular job required more than 3 sets of hands, and Henrietta, was trying to figure out how to accomplish it with 2.5, me's contribution being enthusiastic but variable. He showed her how to mix the mortar for the limestone, the correct proportion of lime and sand and water, and he did it by demonstrating rather than explaining, which she appreciated. He helped her lay the foundation level, because level mattered more than she would have thought, and he was methodical and patient about it in a way that suggested he had learned that lesson the hard and expensive way himself. He showed George, at George's insistent request, how to properly square a corner, and George spent 2 entire days doing nothing but checking corners, which was at least one way to keep him occupied. In the evenings, when the light went soft and gold, and the heat of the day began to ease, Levi would sometimes stay for supper. Not always, and not presumptively. He was careful about it, careful in a way that told Henrietta he was aware of the particular delicacy of her situation. A widow woman alone with 3 children on an isolated piece of land, and that he had no intention of making her uncomfortable or giving anyone within 20 miles cause to talk. The nearest town of any substance was Dodge City, 15 miles west, but the nearest neighbors were the Calhoun family, about 4 miles south, and people in isolated country paid attention to what their neighbors did. So he was careful. He ate supper with them when invited, and was always gone before dark, and he never presumed. What he was, instead, was easy to be around in a way that Henrietta had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. He was not a talker by nature, but he was not unfriendly. He listened well, which was a rarer quality than most people understood, and he had the steady, unhurried quality of a man who was comfortable inside his own silence, and therefore made the silences of others comfortable too. He told her, one evening while they sat on the nearly completed wall of the house watching the sun go down in a spectacular arrangement of orange and purple that Kansas skies produced with casual extravagance, that he had come from Tennessee originally 6 years ago. "What brought you west?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive but genuinely considering the question. "The war was done," he said, "and Tennessee felt different afterward. I was 24 and I wanted land that was mine and only mine, that did not have a history I had not chosen." He paused. "This country does not have a clean history either, I know that. The Comanche and the Kiowa and the Cheyenne were pushed off ground that was theirs long before any of us arrived, and that is a wrong that does not go away because it is convenient to ignore it. But Kansas at least was not a place where I had watched people I knew bleed. I wanted to start somewhere that was new to me." She looked at him. She had not expected this particular kind of honesty, the acknowledgement of the injustice, from a man who had claimed land in the same way she was claiming hers. "You were in the war?" she asked. "Yes." He did not elaborate and she did not press. The war had left marks on men that were not always visible and were not always anyone else's business. "Thomas, my husband, was not well enough to fight," she said, in the measured way she had learned to talk about Thomas, with enough distance to keep from either falsely idealizing him or unfairly diminishing him. "He had a lung condition. He worked in a dry goods store in St. Louis for the duration, and for 7 years after, and then he died of it, the lung condition, 2 winters ago. He was 37. "I am sorry," Levi said, and it was simply said without the effortful sympathy that most people applied to condolence, as though it were something that required decoration. It was just true, and she felt that. "We were not unhappy," she said after a moment. "I want to be honest about that. We were not a great love story. We were 2 people who suited each other well enough and built a life together, and when he was gone I missed him, and then I realized that the life we had built was built on rented ground and borrowed time, and that I needed to build something real." She looked at her hands in her lap. "So here I am. Here you are," he agreed. And then quietly, "You are doing well, Mrs. Kendrick." "Henrietta," she said. She was not certain why she said it. "You have been carrying limestone for my walls. I think you have earned the right to my first name." Something moved through his expression, something brief and unguarded and real, before his habitual steadiness settled back over it. "Henrietta," he said, and the sound of it was different in his voice than it was in anyone else's, and she noticed this and filed it away in the part of herself that she was being very careful about. The house was finished by the end of June. It was small, 2 rooms, with a packed dirt floor that she intended to improve upon when she had the time and resources, and the limestone walls kept it cool in a way that she was deeply grateful for as July arrived and attempted to cook the Kansas plain into something resembling a clay pot. The cast-iron stove fit perfectly in the kitchen room, as though it had always been destined for this particular corner of this particular building, and the first night she cooked supper on it in the new house and watched her children eat at the table that she and Clara and Levi had built from lumber purchased in Dodge City, she felt something that she recognized, after a moment's consideration, as genuine happiness. Not the breathless, contingent happiness of youth, the kind that depends on everything going right. The quieter, sturdier kind, the kind that knows it is sitting next to difficulty and loss and uncertainty, and has decided to persist anyway. She wrote this in her journal that night, while the children slept. Then she fell asleep herself, and slept deeply and without dreaming, and woke up ready. The summer developed its rhythms, and Henrietta settled into them with determination. She had planted a kitchen garden in June, and it was beginning to produce, tentatively, the way plants do when they are not entirely sure about the soil they have been asked to grow in. She had squash coming in, and beans, and the corn she had planted in a hopeful row along the south-facing wall of the house was actually looking promising, though she had been told by nearly everyone. She consulted that corn in this part of Kansas was ambitious to the point of foolishness. She discovered, through the pragmatic education of necessity, that the creek bed at the south end of her property ran dry in July as the land office clerk had promised, but that if you dug 2 feet down in the right spot, you hit damp sand, and if you dug 4 feet down in the right spot, you hit water. She spent 3 days digging those 4 feet, alone, because the children were too small to be useful and Levi was occupied with a problem of his own, a section of fence that his cattle had breached, and that required urgent repair before the herd wandered onto the grazing land of his southern neighbor. When he came over 3 days later and found the bucket hanging in a 4-foot hole at the south end of her property, he stood at the edge of it and looked in, and then looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "You dug this yourself," he said. "The children helped," she said, which was generous, but she had let me carry 3 buckets of dirt away from the edge, which meant it counted. "In 3 days. In 3 days." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There is a man in Dodge City who sells hand pumps. A pump with proper casing would serve you better than a bucket. I am going to town next week. If you want me to bring one back, I will show you how to fit it." She wanted to say she could figure out a hand pump on her own. She probably could have, but she also had approximately 63 things on her list that required doing before winter, and accepting help where it made sense was a form of intelligence, not weakness. "How much will it cost?" she asked. "I will price it when I am there. I can put it on my account if the cost is inconvenient right now, and you can repay me when the harvest comes in." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Make things easier for me." He held her gaze, and there was something in it that was direct and honest and also careful, as though he had thought about the words before he said them. "Because it makes sense to help your neighbor," he said. "And because," he paused, "you are the most capable person I have met in 6 years of living in this country, and it seems right to support that." She did not know what to say to this. She was not accustomed to being seen with that quality of clarity. Thomas had loved her, she believed, but he had loved a version of her that was softened and domesticated and safely contained within the walls of a St. Louis rental. Levi Keene looked at her the way you look at the open country, with appreciation for everything that is actually there. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than the pump. July brought a complication in the form of a man named Cyrus Aldridge, who rode onto the Kendrick property on a gray morning with two other men behind him and a deed in his hand. Aldridge was a cattleman from Dodge City, heavyset and prosperous, with the particular confidence of a man who had gotten what he wanted through a combination of money and persistence for long enough that he had stopped imagining any other outcome. "Mrs. Kendrick," he said, from the saddle, without dismounting, which told her immediately what she needed to know about how he intended this conversation to go. "I understand you have filed on this section." "I have," she said. She was standing in front of her house, and she was steady. "I have to be direct with you, ma'am. This land is part of a grazing route that my cattle have used for 3 years. I had an informal arrangement with the county to keep this section clear of homestead claims on the basis that it is not suitable for farming. I am farming it," she said. "With respect, ma'am, the creek is dry, the soil is poor, and you have 3 children and no husband. There are better parcels available west of here near Dodge, where the land is good and the proximity to town would serve a widow woman better than this isolated stretch." "I am not interested in other parcels," she said. "I am interested in this one, which I hold legal title to, and I would like you to take your cattle drive elsewhere." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment, and his 2 companions, who had said nothing, shifted in their saddles. "This is not a fight you want, Mrs. Kendrick," he said, and his voice had lost the surface courtesy. "I have the deed," she said. "The law is clear. If your cattle cross my land line, I will be in Dodge City the following morning filing a complaint with the county land office. I know the clerk's name. I know the judge's name. I have made it my business to know these things." Aldridge studied her. She did not look away. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "No," she said quietly, "you are making it harder than it needs to be, Mr. Aldridge. I am simply standing on my own land." They left. She watched them ride away south, and then she walked back inside her house and sat down at the kitchen table and breathed carefully for approximately 2 minutes while her hands shook, because that had been frightening in a way she had not let herself show, and she was not sure she had heard the last of it. She had not. Levi appeared at her door that evening, and from the expression on his face she understood that word traveled quickly in empty country. "Aldridge came by," he said, not a question. "He did." "He is not a violent man," Levi said, "but he is a persistent one, and he has money and a lawyer, and he knows how to make things uncomfortable for people who are in a weak legal position." "Am I in a weak legal position?" she asked. "No, your deed is clean, your filing was proper, and the informal arrangement he mentioned with the county is not worth the paper it was never written on, but that does not always matter as much as it should. Will you help me?" She asked directly, because she had learned by now that directness was the native language of this country. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I know the county surveyor, and I know Judge Harlan in Dodge City. I can put it in front of people who will make it clear to Aldridge that his informal arrangement was informal because it had no legal standing. He will find another route. It will not be comfortable, but it will be resolved." She looked at him across her kitchen table. "You are very certain," she said. "I am certain that you have the right of it," he said. "The rest follows from that." He went to Dodge City the following week, and the week after that Cyrus Aldridge's cattle drive went around the Kendrick parcel by half a mile, which added time to the journey and cost Aldridge a modest but stinging amount of money. Aldridge did not return. It was not until after this was done and the threat was behind her that Henrietta allowed herself to sit with the particular warmth of knowing that Levi Keene had ridden to Dodge City not to sort out his own business but to sort out hers. He had not made a point of it. He had not asked for acknowledgement. He had simply done it, the way he did most things, with a quiet efficiency that was, she was beginning to understand, its own form of eloquence. She baked him an apple pie. It was not quite an apple pie, because the apples were dried and had to be reconstituted, and the crust was not as flaky as she would have liked because lard was expensive, but it was real and it was hers, and she carried it over to his property on a bright August morning. He opened the door in his shirt sleeves and looked at the pie and then at her, and something in his face changed in a way she had become attuned to, a softening that was brief and unguarded and that she had started to look for without entirely meaning to. "What is this for?" he asked. "It is for the way you handled Aldridge," she said, "and for the hand pump, and for the mortar instructions, and because I wanted to." He took the pie. "Come in," he said. "I have coffee." She went in. His house was clean in the practical way of a man who lived alone, not spotless but orderly, with everything in a place that made sense and nothing unnecessary cluttering the surfaces. There was a bookshelf, and this surprised her into stopping to look at it because it was well stocked for a cattle ranch in the middle of Kansas. "You read," she said. "Most evenings," he said. He was pouring coffee from the pot on the stove. "It is a good antidote to loneliness." The word landed in the room with a quiet weight, honest and unembellished. She looked at his profile as he poured, the strong line of his jaw, the particular way he held himself, and she thought about what it would mean to be genuinely lonely in this wide and empty country, to have built a good life and a working ranch and to come home to it every evening alone. "Do you read to the children sometimes?" she asked. "I mean, you are welcome to," she added quickly, because it had come out in a way that sounded presumptuous. He handed her the coffee cup and their fingers brushed, and neither of them moved away from it immediately. "I would like that," he said, and his voice was careful in the particular way of someone who is saying one true thing and meaning several. "George has been asking about books," she said. "He wants to know about cattle ranching specifically, which I cannot help him with, but I suspect you could." "I have a book about exactly that," Levi said, and now the smile arrived fully, genuine and warm and transformative in the way it changed his face, and she found herself smiling back with an ease that startled her. August turned into September, and the quality of the evenings changed, grew longer and cooler, and Levi began coming over after supper to read to the children. He came 3 or 4 times a week, and he was good at it in a way she had not anticipated, because reading to children well requires not just literacy but a kind of performance, an ability to inhabit the voices of characters, and Levi had this. He read George stories about cattle drives, and he read Clara a novel that he had found in the back of his saddlebag, and which turned out to be unexpectedly romantic, which made Clara pink with pleasure. He read me picture-illustrated books about animals in a voice that was low and solemn, and that me found so satisfying she fell asleep to it every single time, which meant he was also, incidentally, solving the problem of me's bedtime. After the children were in bed, he and Henrietta sat at her kitchen table and talked. This was, she would think later, when she was trying to trace the particular geography of how she had fallen in love with Levi Keene, where most of the essential work was done. Not the physical help, though that mattered deeply. Not the protection from Aldridge, though that had shown her something important about his character. It was the evenings at the kitchen table, with the coffee cups between them and the candle burning down, and the silence outside so complete that they could hear the distant movement of his cattle when they talked. They talked about everything. About the land and how to work it, and what it asked of the people who tried. About their childhoods, his in Tennessee in a house with 4 brothers, and hers in Ohio with a father who had taught her to read Latin, which had prepared her for very little in the practical world, but which gave her an enduring love of language. About the country and its troubles, the years of Reconstruction following the war, the ongoing and unanswered question of what the westward push of settlement meant for the people who had lived here first. Levi spoke about these things with a clarity that sometimes surprised her, because he was a man who had chosen the same process that was displacing others, and he held that contradiction without flinching from it. "I think about it," he said one evening, when they had been talking about the Cheyenne camps that the Army had pushed north the previous year. "I think about the fact that what I am building here, is only possible because of something unjust, and I do not know how to resolve that. I only know that being honest about it seems better than not being." "Yes," she said, "the land was taken, the taking was wrong. That does not disappear because we are here now and trying to build something decent." "No," he agreed, It does not disappear, but perhaps the decent building still matters. I think it must, she said, or what are we doing here? He looked at her in the candlelight, and the expression on his face was one she could not fully decipher, too layered for quick translation, but what she could identify in it was something that looked like a man deciding something. He did not act on whatever that decision was that evening. He said good night with his customary steadiness and walked back across the stone-lined fence in the dark, and she watched the shape of him recede into the Kansas night, and felt the absence of him in a way that was both startling and clarifying. She wrote in her journal that night for a long time. The harvest, when it came, was not magnificent, but it was real. The corn had produced against all pessimistic expectation, not abundantly, but enough. The kitchen garden gave her squash and beans and onions, and enough potato that she could look at the approaching winter without her stomach clenching. She had put up jar upon jar of preserved vegetables through September, working with Clara by the stove until her hands were permanently pruned from the steam, and her back ached in a way that 4 hours of sleep did not fully repair. When Levi helped her bring in the corn, she paid him with the corn itself, a portion of the harvest, which he accepted without argument because they had discussed it and agreed on the terms before the season started, and because this was how neighbors worked, in exchange and mutuality rather than charity. This mattered to her enormously, the mutuality of it, and she believed it mattered to him too. She also helped him. She spent 2 October days with Clara helping to process the wild plums that grew along the north fence line of his property, which he had neither the time nor the particular domestic skill to put up himself, and she sent him home with 14 jars of plum preserve that winter would make him grateful for. This was when she first told him about Ohio. Not just the facts of her childhood there, which she had mentioned before, but the feeling of it, the particular quality of the life she had lived before Thomas and before St. Louis and before widowhood and before Kansas. The girl she had been, curious and bookish and faintly restless in a way that she had not known how to name until she got out here and named it. She had always been someone who needed more room than the respectable life offered. You would not have been happy in a parlor, he said, and it was not critical. It was simply observational. No, she agreed. I tried very hard to be for a long time. And now? She looked out at the flat golden immensity of October, Kansas, at the haze on the horizon, and the sky that went on so far it made you feel the specific smallness of a person in a way that was more comforting than frightening if you were the right kind of person, and she said, "Now I am very happy in this." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I." And she understood that he was not merely agreeing with her assessment of Kansas. The moment was there, present and warm and real. She felt it, and she believed he felt it, and neither of them moved into it or away from it. They simply held it between them, like something fragile that needed time before it could bear weight. November came in cold and serious, and the social landscape of the plains required navigating. The town of Willowbend, 8 miles east, which was smaller than Dodge City but closer and more neighborly, had a social gathering once a month in the meeting hall behind the general store. The Calhouns, who were Henrietta's nearest neighbors to the south, had come over in October to introduce themselves properly, and it was Mrs. Calhoun, a sensible woman named Dorothea with 6 children of her own and excellent practical advice about Kansas winters, who mentioned the Willowbend socials. "You ought to come," Dorothea said. "You and the children. Folks in these parts like to know their neighbors, and it is good for the children to have other children to run with." Henrietta went in November, and she brought the children, and Levi happened to be going too, which was not, she suspected, entirely a coincidence. The social was held in a long, low room lit with oil lamps, and it smelled of pine pitch and dried herbs and the particular combination of warm bodies and winter clothing that meant people gathering in enclosed spaces. There was a fiddle player, and a man who played the concertina, and dancing, the simple pattern dances of the frontier. Nothing elaborate but enthusiastic. There was food brought by every family, and cider, and enough conversation to last the entire winter. Henrietta danced, because she had loved dancing since girlhood and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, and she danced with the cowhound's eldest son, who was 16 and deeply earnest, and with the general store owner, Mr. Pickett, who was 50 and light on his feet, and with various other men who asked her politely. Levi Keene stood against the far wall with a cup of cider and watched, with the focused expression of a man who was trying to look as though he were doing something other than watching. She did not ask him to dance. She waited. He came to her during the third tune, when the fiddle was playing something slow enough to justify a different kind of dancing than the reel they had been doing, and he held out his hand without speaking, because some invitations do not require words, and she took it. They danced well together, which she had not known, and which therefore surprised her in a way that was also something else entirely, a warmth that started in her hands where he held them, and traveled to a place in her chest that had been very quiet for a long time. He was taller than she was by nearly a foot, and he danced with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, present and careful and steady. "You dance," she said. "My mother taught all 5 of her sons," he said. "She said a man who could not dance was at a disadvantage in life." "She was correct," Henrietta said. "She was correct about most things," he said. "I have come to understand that more clearly as I have gotten older." She laughed, and the laugh was genuine and unguarded, and she saw it land on him like sunlight. They danced twice, which was enough in a public gathering of this kind to be noticeable but not enough to be remarkable, and afterward they sat side by side and talked with the cowhounds and the Picketts and a farming family named Swenson who had come from Sweden 7 years ago, and built something remarkable on a piece of ground that everyone had thought was too rocky to farm. Henrietta liked the Swensons immediately. Mr. Swenson, whose first name was Arne, had the philosophical equanimity of a man who had moved across an ocean, and was therefore not troubled by anything as modest as a Kansas winter. On the ride home, the 4 of them in the wagon with Levi riding alongside on his roan, the children fell asleep one by one until all 3 were leaning against each other in the wagon bed like a set of nested Russian dolls, and Henrietta held the reins and drove through the cold, clear November dark with stars overhead like scattered salt. "Mrs. Calhoun told me something interesting tonight," she said. Levi, riding a few feet off her left shoulder, turned his head toward her. "What was that?" "She said that when I first arrived in June and filed my claim, you went to the land office and made certain that the deed was properly recorded in the county registry. That there were no errors in the filing." Silence for a moment. The horse's breath plumed in the cold. "She told you that," he said. "She did. She said your friend, the county surveyor, mentioned it to her husband." "Small country," Levi said in a tone that might have been mildly rueful. "You did not tell me," she said. "No. Why not?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because you did not need to know in order for it to be worth doing. And because you would have said something about not being a charity case." "I would have," she admitted. "I did not want you to say that," he said, and his voice was low and direct and honest in the particular way that she had come to recognize as his most essential quality. "I wanted you to just be safe, to have the ground under you secure." She held the reins and looked at the road ahead, a pale ribbon through the dark grass, and felt something inside her open like a door that had been only slightly ajar and now swung wide. "Levi," she said. "Yes. Thank you," she paused, "for all of it." "Henrietta," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was the same as it had always been, carrying something in it that she now knew how to hear. "I would do it again. I would do all of it again." She did not say anything else. Neither did he. They drove through the dark together, and the silence between them was full and warm and real, and it was, she thought, the most genuinely companionable she had felt in years. December arrived with snow, real snow, not the dusting she had expected from Kansas winters, but several consecutive storms that piled white against the limestone walls of her house, and buried the stone fence line so completely that the boundary between her property and Levi's disappeared under a smooth, unmarked field of white. She was not unprepared. She had spent October and November methodically getting ready, laying in firewood, banking the house walls with extra sod for insulation, storing enough provisions to carry 4 people through until March if necessary. Her neighbors had helped her understand what a Kansas winter demanded, and she had listened to all of it. But the first major storm, arriving in the second week of December with a force that shook the limestone walls and drove snow through every small gap in the mortar, was nonetheless a lesson in the difference between knowing something and experiencing it. The temperature dropped with terrifying speed, and she was aware, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature, that she was 15 miles from town, 4 miles from the cowhounds, and that if anything went seriously wrong there was no one to call. There was, however, Levi. He appeared at her door during the second day of the storm, having walked across the buried stone line through knee-deep snow, with a rucksack on his back and an expression that was steady as ever, but with something underneath the steadiness that told her the walk had not been entirely casual. He was covered in snow from hat to boot, and his face was red with cold. "Are you all right?" he asked, even before she had the door fully open. "We are all right," she said. "Get in here." He came in and she shut the door against the howling white outside, and Clara immediately appeared with a towel, because Clara was 11 and had a practical streak that would carry her through most of what life intended to offer her. George appeared behind Clara and stared at Levi's snow-crusted coat with enormous respect, as though Levi had accomplished something legendary. Mie appeared from somewhere and attached herself to Levi's arm before he had taken the coat off. "I brought you this," he said, setting the rucksack on the table and opening it to reveal dried beef, a paper sack of cornmeal, and a jar of honey. "And this," he added, pulling a book from the side pocket that made me gasp with delight. He stayed 2 days. There was nothing improper in it, and she did not think anyone with sense would have found it improper given the conditions, and she had not much patience left for worrying about what people who lacked sense might say. He slept in the kitchen, on the floor by the stove, wrapped in his bedroll, and she slept in the back room with the children. And in the mornings she woke to find the fire built up and coffee made and Levi reading to George, who had woken early and crawled directly onto Levi's lap in the manner of a 6-year-old girl, named me rather than an 8-year-old boy who had strong opinions about cowboys. On the evening of the second day, with the storm still howling outside and the 4 children, because me and Levi together had somehow decided that Levi counted as a large child, asleep in the back room in a heap of quilts that defied all architectural logic, Henrietta and Levi sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the candle burning low. She had been thinking about this for a long time. Since September, if she was honest, or perhaps earlier, perhaps since the morning she had found him sleeping against his fence post and shaken his hand across the stone line and noticed the quality of his eyes. "Levi," she said. "Yes," he said, and something in his voice told her he had been thinking about this too. "I want to ask you something directly," she said, "because I have found that directness serves us both better than otherwise." "It does," he agreed. "Do you have feelings for me?" she asked. "Of the romantic kind. I am asking plainly because I am 32 years old and a widow with 3 children, and I do not have time for the sort of slow-moving uncertainty that younger people can afford." He was quiet for a moment, but it was not the quiet of a man searching for an answer. It was the quiet of a man choosing the words for an answer he already had. "Yes," he said, "I have had them for some time." "Have you not said so?" He met her eyes, and his were very steady and very honest. "Because you did not need a man's feelings complicating your first year in a new place with a new life you were building," he said. "Because what you needed was a neighbor and a friend and someone to help lay limestone and deal with Cyrus Aldridge, and I wanted to give you what you needed without making it about what I wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a remarkable thing," she said quietly. "Is it?" "Most men would not have been that careful," she said. Most men would have pressed their advantage. I do not think of it as an advantage, he said. I think of it as your life, which you have the entire right to build as you choose without anyone pressing anything upon you. The candle flame trembled in a draft from somewhere in the wall, and in the flickering light his face was warm and serious and entirely familiar to her now, the face of a man she had come to know with the slow, thorough certainty of daily proximity. I have feelings for you too, she said. Of the same kind. I have been trying to be sensible about them for several months. Something shifted in him, visible even in the candlelight, a kind of held breath released, a tension eased. Have you? He said, and it was not quite a question. I have. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was large and warm and still, and he turned his hand over and held hers with a gentleness that was almost painful in its care. I do not know exactly what this looks like yet, she said. I have 3 children and a homestead claim and a life I have only just started building, and you have your own ranch and your own life, and I am not a woman who will simply fold herself into another person's shape. I know that, he said. I would not want you to, and I am not certain how neighbors manage this kind of thing without the whole of Willowbend having an opinion about it. Willowbend will have an opinion regardless, he said. I have found it is better to give them something true to talk about than to deny them anything and have them invent something worse. She laughed and felt the laugh all the way down to her feet, warm and real. That is very practical, she said. I am a practical man, he said. And then more quietly, with the simple directness that she had come to understand was the most essential thing about him. I want to court you, Henrietta, properly, with your permission. And with no particular schedule attached. Because you have all the time you need to decide whatever it is you want to decide. She looked at his hand holding hers, and at his face in the candlelight, and thought about the stone-lined fence buried in snow outside, and how the boundary between their 2 pieces of land had disappeared under winter white until you could not see where one ended and the other began. You have my permission, she said. The winter passed. This is not to say it passed easily, because Kansas winters in 1873 were not gentle, and there were days of bitter cold and days when the children were confined to the house and drove each other and their mother to the edge of madness, and days when the firewood supply looked insufficient and she had to do careful arithmetic to figure out how to stretch it. But it passed with a quality to it that was different from any winter she had known before, warmer in all the ways that mattered beyond temperature. Because Levi Keene was a daily presence now, across the stone line and frequently on her side of it, and the children had accepted him into the fabric of their daily life with the ease of children who are fundamentally sensible about love. George had, somewhere in October, begun following Levi around his property when allowed, learning everything about cattle that a human brain could hold, and he had developed the habit of reporting his findings to Henrietta with the seriousness of a naturalist reporting field observations. The roan's name is Samuel, he informed her one evening. Levi named him after his uncle, and the longhorn with the crooked left horn is called Trouble because she always is. Very useful information, Henrietta said. Levi said I can help with the spring branding, George said, in a tone that indicated this was the pinnacle of human experience, and he expected it to define the rest of his life. Clara had quietly and without fanfare decided that Levi was trustworthy, which was Clara's highest category of evaluation, and she demonstrated this by showing him her journal, which she had never shown anyone. He read a single entry that she indicated, and said, very seriously, that she had a gift for description and ought to keep writing, and Clara had carried this observation inside her like a lamp for weeks. Mee had simply loved him from the morning he accepted her wildflowers, and continued to love him with the uncomplicated totality of a 6-year-old who had decided. Henrietta and Levi courted through the winter with a restraint that was both appropriate to the time and to her situation, and also quietly excruciating in the way that restrained feelings always are when the feeling is genuine and large and not easily contained. He brought her things she needed, and things she didn't strictly need but that he thought she would enjoy. A packet of better seeds from the catalog, a novel from the Willowbend General Store, a small silver brooch that had belonged to his mother and that he said, quietly and seriously, had been waiting for the right person. They talked every evening when possible, sometimes at her table, sometimes at his, and the conversations ranged across everything: the land and the children and books and history and memory and hope. He told her about the woman he had almost married in Tennessee before the war, a girl named Louise who had married someone else while he was away and done the right thing and been happy, he thought, and how he had arrived in Kansas still carrying the shape of that almost love but finding, year by year, that it had faded into something more like a lesson than a wound. She taught me what I wanted, he said, not what I needed, which I had to figure out separately. What did you need? Henrietta asked. He looked at her across the table with those clear hazel eyes and said, someone who had been through something real and came out the other side of it with their backbone still in them. She held this for a long moment. You are a good man, Levi Keene, she said. I try to be, he said, and the simplicity of it was everything. In February, he kissed her for the first time. It happened at her door, on a cold, bright evening when the snow had turned the world silver and the stars were so sharp they seemed to cut the sky, and he had been about to leave and he turned back instead, and she had been watching him go and had stopped, and they stood at the door in the cold for a moment that felt suspended. He asked, which was so characteristic of him and so right that it made her heart feel too large for her chest. He said, quietly and seriously, "May I?" And she said yes, and he kissed her with a gentleness and a care that was also a kind of honesty, not tentative, but measured, the way you handle something you understand to be precious. She held the feeling of it long after he was gone, standing at her door in the cold with the silver Kansas night all around her, and she understood that this was the real thing, the thing she had been reading about in books since girlhood without entirely believing in, and that it had arrived not in the form she might have imagined, not young and breathless and unearned, but earned, genuinely and thoroughly earned, by months of demonstrated character and daily truth. Spring came back with the vehemence of seasons that have been kept waiting. March swept in on warm southern winds and the snow retreated, and the creek bed filled briefly with snowmelt, and the land turned improbably, defiantly green. The cottonwood, which Henrietta had privately been concerned about through the winter, put out leaves with the enthusiastic commitment of a tree that had simply been waiting for its moment. Henrietta planted everything. She had spent the winter revising her agricultural strategy based on what she had learned in her first season, adjusting the proportions of what she planted and where, understanding now, from experience rather than theory, where the moisture held longest and where the drainage was best, and how the light fell on different parts of the property through the day. She had also, through careful correspondence with the Land Office Extension Service in Topeka, learned that the soil of the Kendrick parcel, for all its difficulties, had particular properties that suited certain crops that she had not tried yet, drought-resistant varieties that the Extension Service was encouraging homesteaders to experiment with. Levi helped her plant, and she helped him with his spring fencing work, and George was allowed to participate in the branding, and spent the subsequent 2 weeks narrating this experience to anyone who would hold still long enough to listen. The social life of the area continued to include them together without either of them having to announce anything in particular. At the April Willowbend social, they danced without needing to wait for the slow tunes, because by now they understood each other well enough to dance through anything, and Dorothea Calhoun watched them from across the room and smiled the smile of a woman who is satisfied by the evidence of things working out as they ought. The one moment of difficulty that spring came from within rather than without. It came on a warm April evening when Henrietta was transplanting seedlings, and she stopped in the middle of the kitchen garden and had a sudden, acute attack of doubt that arrived without warning and sat on her chest with considerable weight. She sat back on her heels in the garden and let it come, because she had learned that fighting these things only prolonged them. The doubt was this: she had built this land and this life by herself, for herself and her children, and the thought of joining it to another person's life, of making decisions in partnership rather than alone, of being seen so closely by another person that the gaps in her own character would be visible, this thought was frightening. Not because Levi was frightening. Quite the opposite. It was frightening because he was so clearly good, and because she loved him, and because loving someone that truly meant you could lose them, and she knew what loss felt like and did not know if she was equal to it again. She sat in the garden for a while with this fear and looked at it honestly. Then Clara came and sat beside her without being asked, the way Clara did, with her 11-year-old's uncanny sensitivity to her mother's internal weather, and leaned against her shoulder. "Are you thinking about Mr. Keene?" Clara asked. "I am," Henrietta said. "I think he would be good for us," Clara said, with the careful precision of a child offering a considered opinion rather than a demand. "He is not trying to be our father. He is just himself, and he likes us, and he makes you different." "Different how?" Henrietta asked. Clara thought about this seriously. "Lighter," she said. "You were very good before, but you were heavier." Henrietta looked at her daughter, this precise and remarkable person who had her father's serious face and her own backbone, and felt a love for her that was so physical it almost hurt. "When did you get so wise?" she asked. "I have always been wise," Clara said. "You are only just noticing." That evening, Henrietta walked across the stone line to Levi's property and found him on his porch in the last of the daylight, reading. He looked up when she came through the fence gap and read her face with the attentiveness he brought to everything, and set the book down. "I need to say something," she said, sitting on the porch step. "All right," he said. "I am afraid," she said. "Not of you. Of losing someone again. Of building something with someone and having it taken. I know that fear is not a reason to refuse life, but I want you to know it is there, because I think honesty between us is the thing that makes all the rest of this possible, and this is part of being honest." He was quiet for a moment, and then he came off the chair and sat beside her on the step, close enough that the warmth of him was present. "I know about that fear," he said. "I have it too. This," he gestured between them, "is not a small thing, and small things do not scare people the way big things do." "No," she agreed. "I cannot promise nothing will go wrong," he said. "I cannot promise the land will always produce, or the weather will be reasonable, or that we will not have years that are harder than we want them to be. I cannot promise I will always know the right thing to do. But I can promise that I will always be honest with you, and that whatever comes, I will face it with you, and that I will love your children the way they deserve to be loved." She looked at him, and the last of the April light was in his eyes, and she thought about the stone-lined fence buried in winter snow, the boundary that disappeared, and the two pieces of ground that stretched on unmarked and continuous. "Levi Keene," she said, "will you ask me to marry you?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was several things at once, surprised and then not surprised, and then simply, unmistakably, happy in a way that was so complete it made the air around him seem different. "Henrietta Kendrick," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I absolutely will." He kissed her on the porch in the April evening with considerably more feeling than the February kiss at the door, and the roan horse Samuel watched them from the corral with calm, intelligent equanimity. They were married in June, on the land that had started it, the Kendrick parcel that was no longer the least wanted land in the county, because Henrietta had made something of it in exactly the way she had promised herself she would. The wedding was small and genuine. Dorothea Calhoun and her husband and the 6 Calhoun children, the Swensons, Mr. Pickett from the general store, and the county surveyor who had helped Levi get her deed properly registered, and the minister from Willowbend, a practical man named Reverend Holt, who performed the ceremony under the leaning cottonwood, which stood now, after a full year of Henrietta's presence, notably straighter than it had been. Clara and George and me stood in the front row with a gravity appropriate to the occasion. George had polished his boots with obsessive attention. Clara wore a dress she had altered herself from one of Henrietta's old ones and looked in it startlingly like a young woman rather than a child. Me had put wildflowers in her hair and then attempted to put wildflowers in everyone else's hair and had partially succeeded with Levi, who had allowed 2 flowers to be pinned above his ear and worn them through the ceremony with absolute seriousness. When Reverend Holt said the words that made them married, Levi held her hands and looked at her face with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, direct and steady, and full of a love that was not theatrical or performative, but simply, essentially real, like the limestone walls of her house, solid and enduring and built to last. She was not a woman who cried easily. She cried then, briefly and without embarrassment, and he wiped her face with his thumb and smiled at her, and she laughed, and it was better than any fairy tale she had read as a girl in Ohio, because it was actually true. They had a wedding supper on the grass in front of the house, and the fiddle player from the Willowbend socials came and played until the stars appeared, and they danced on the Kansas ground under the open sky, and George danced with me until she fell down laughing, and Clara danced with the oldest Calhoun boy and turned pink again, and Levi danced with Henrietta until the fiddle stopped. The decision about the land was made without difficulty, because both of them were practical people. He moved into her house, which had 2 rooms and would need a third. His cattle grazed the combined acreage of both properties. His ranch house, which was sturdier and had more storage, was used for the overflow of his equipment, and eventually, over the following months, they began to think about how to use the extra structure wisely. The third room happened in August. Levi cut the limestone himself, from the same bluff where he had sourced the original walls, and this time George was old enough to genuinely help rather than symbolically contribute, and the 2 of them, man and boy, spent 10 August days hauling and cutting and laying stone, while Henrietta and Clara and me provided water and food and opinionated architectural commentary. "The window should face east," Clara said. "Why?" Levi asked. "Because the morning light is best," Clara said, as though this were self-evident, which Henrietta agreed it was. The window faced east. The new room was finished in September, and it was Henrietta's room to use as she chose, which meant it became, over the following weeks, a combination of library, office for her increasingly detailed agricultural records, and the place where she sat in the morning light with her coffee and her journal, and the particular piece of a person who has built exactly what they intended. Fall came in golden and generous, and the second harvest was significantly better than the first, because Henrietta had spent a winter thinking about it and a spring implementing what she had thought. The drought-resistant varieties from the Topeka extension did well. The corn did better than the first year. The kitchen garden produced so abundantly that she was able to trade surplus vegetables with the Swensons and the Calhouns, and the social web of the area tightened around them in the way of rural communities, where people understand that mutual assistance is not charity but survival strategy. Levi sold cattle in October at Dodge City and came home with the proceeds of a good year on the market and a practical and unromantic satisfaction that was nonetheless infectious. He spread the account papers on the kitchen table and showed her the numbers, and they talked about what needed to be invested in the property and what could be set aside and what should be sent to the bank in Dodge City for years that were less generous. "You are good at this," she said, looking at his careful columns of figures. "I have had years of practice keeping myself from going broke," he said. "It sharpens the arithmetic." She laughed. And then, leaning over the papers, she said, without looking up, "I believe I am going to have a child." The silence was complete for 3 full seconds. Then she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that was, for a brief moment, entirely unguarded in the way he rarely allowed himself to be, open and bright and almost undone by the feeling. "Henrietta," he said. "I thought perhaps by November," she said, keeping her voice practical, because her voice would do what her voice needed to do, or possibly December. I am not entirely certain of the timing. He came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with that open, brilliant expression, and then he kissed her forehead with such tenderness that she had to breathe carefully. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I have done this before, 3 times in fact, and under considerably less comfortable circumstances." "Are you happy?" he asked. She covered his hands with hers. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," she said. "This is true, and I want you to know it." The baby arrived at the very end of November, as it turned out, in the manner of all first children together, arriving somewhat ahead of schedule and making itself known with decisive urgency. Dorothea Calhoun came in her capacity as the nearest experienced person, and Clara stayed up to be useful in her precise and competent way, and Levi, who had been told firmly to stay in the kitchen, spent the better part of 8 hours sitting at the kitchen table with his hands locked together, demonstrating, George told him later with 8-year-old insight, the greatest stillness he had ever displayed in a man clearly wanting to do something. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and loud, and possessed from his first hour of life of a black-haired shock of hair that could only have come from Henrietta, and an expression of squinting assessment that was unmistakably Levi. They named him William Thomas Keene, William for Levi's father, Thomas, quietly and without drama, for Henrietta's first husband, because the past did not need to be erased in order to make room for the present. George, informed of the middle name, was briefly troubled by this, and then said, with the philosophical adjustment of a child who trusts the adults making decisions, "That is all right, I suppose." Mee immediately appointed herself the baby's primary companion, a role she pursued with exhausting dedication. Clara held William with the careful seriousness she brought to everything important and looked at him for a long time. "He has your mouth," she told Levi, "and Mama's nose." She considered this arrangement. "He will be handsome," she said, which was simply a report of what she observed, and both Henrietta and Levi accepted it as such. The winter of 1874 was milder than the winter before it, and the house, larger now with the 3rd room, held the warmth well, and the family inside it generated considerable warmth of their own. William was a content baby, which Henrietta attributed to the fact that he was surrounded at all times by 4 other people who wanted to look at him, and who could blame him for being satisfied with the arrangement. Levi Keene, who had spent 6 years on the Kansas plain alone with his cattle and his books and his fence lines, adapted to fatherhood with a naturalness that Henrietta watched with quiet amazement. He was good with William in the instinctive, unhurried way he was good with most things, patient and present and fully attentive, not performing the role but simply being in it. He was also good, she noted, with the 3 older children in ways that had never been tested before, because a new baby changes the dynamics of any household and tests the goodwill of older siblings. But Levi never let the older 3 feel diminished by the arrival of the younger, never let them feel they had to compete for his attention. She told him this one winter evening, with William asleep in the cradle and the other 3 in their beds, and the house quiet with the particular deep quiet of a Kansas winter night. They were at the kitchen table, where they had talked through so much of their lives together, and the candle was low and the coffee was good, and she told him, "You did not have to be that kind of man," she said, "but you are, and I want you to know I see it." He looked at her steadily. "Those children are mine," he said simply, "not by blood in 3 cases, but by everything else that matters. I claim them the same way you claimed this land, because I wanted to, because they were worth claiming." She reached across and took his hand. "Yes," she said, "they are." The spring of 1875 brought changes of several kinds. Clara turned 13 and was no longer a child by the standards of the time and place, and Henrietta and Levi discussed her education with the seriousness it warranted. The schoolhouse in Willowbend held classes for children up to 12, But beyond that, education on the frontier was a matter of individual resourcefulness. Levi had an idea. "There is a woman in Dodge City," he said, "a Mrs. Avery who was a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania and who takes private students now. I know the Swensons send their eldest to her. Clara has a remarkable mind and she should have something worthy of it." Henrietta looked at him. "That is expensive." "Not impossibly," he said, "and we had a good year." "Clara would need to stay in Dodge City during the week," Henrietta said. "Mrs. Avery boards students," he said. "It would mean she comes home on weekends." Henrietta thought about this for a while. It was, she knew, the right thing, the good thing. It was the reason she had come to Kansas, not merely to survive but to build something, and building something included giving her children the best she could offer. And the best, in Clara's case, included a woman like Mrs. Avery. She looked at Levi and felt the particular gratitude of a person who loves someone who sees the things they love clearly. "Have you already inquired?" she asked. "I have," he admitted, and the slight shift in his expression was the closest he came to sheepish. "Mrs. Avery has a space for the fall term." "You were confident I would agree," she said. "I was confident you would make the right decision," he said, and the difference between these two things was, she thought, the precise measure of the man. Clara went to Mrs. Avery in September and thrived with the unequivocal thoroughness of a person whose mind has been waiting for adequate room to move. She came home on weekends with her eyes bright and her head full, and sat at the kitchen table, and told Levi and Henrietta everything she was learning. And Levi engaged with her ideas with a seriousness that was not performative, that was simply who he was. George, meanwhile, was George. He was 10 now, and had committed himself entirely to the cattle ranching enterprise, following Levi through every stage of the operation and absorbing information at a rate that suggested he might one day know more about cattle than anyone in Kansas. He was also, Levi noted with private amusement, developing the particular posture of a boy who has spent too much time watching a man he admires, because George had begun to stand with his weight slightly back on his heels, which was Levi's own unconscious habit. He mentioned this to Henrietta one evening, and she laughed until tears ran down her face, because she had noticed it weeks ago and had been waiting to see when he would. Me was 8 in 1875, and Me had decided that she wanted to know about plants. Not in the vague way children want to know about things, but in the focused, purposeful way that suggests a genuine inclination. She followed Henrietta through the kitchen garden with questions that grew more sophisticated week by week, and she had begun, on her own initiative, keeping a small journal in which she drew the plants she observed with a precision that surprised even Clara. "She has an eye," Levi said, looking at Me's drawings one evening with genuine attention. "These are accurate, the details are right." "She sees things," Henrietta agreed. "She has always been like that. Thomas used to say she had his grandmother's sight. I think she simply pays attention in a way most people don't." "That is a great gift," Levi said. "She comes from a family of people who pay attention," Henrietta said, and looked at him as she said it, meaning him in the family she was describing, and he understood, and the expression on his face was very warm. The summer of 1875 brought a drought. Not the total, devastating drought that would come to the Great Plains in later decades, but a serious and extended dry spell that tested everyone in the area with the blunt practicality of a Kansas summer that has decided to demonstrate its power. The creek bed went dry as promised. The hand pump held because the well was deep enough, but it required more work than usual to maintain, and the cattle needed water hauled to them on the days when the pond on Levi's eastern quarter dropped too low. The kitchen garden suffered, and Henrietta gave it everything she had, hauling water bucket by bucket in the mornings before the heat peaked, and she salvaged most of it, though the corn was thinner than she had hoped. The drought-resistant varieties held up better than the standard ones, validating the Extension Service recommendation, and she wrote about this in her agricultural records in detail. because she had begun to think of her records not merely as personal documentation, but as something potentially useful to other homesteaders facing the same challenges. In August, at the Willowbend Social, she found herself in conversation with a woman named Beatrice Harmon who had just filed a homestead claim on a piece of ground 20 miles north, and who was doing it, like Henrietta, alone, as a widow. Henrietta sat with her for an hour and told her everything she knew, every practical thing: soil chemistry and water depth, and the drought-resistant varieties, and the importance of limestone over sod in poor soil, and the value of knowing your county surveyor's name and your judge's name and your deed's recording number. And the woman listened with the focused attention of someone receiving survival instruction, which was exactly what it was. Levi found her afterward and said, "You were there for an hour," and she said, "She needed to know things." And he said, "Yes," with the warmth in his voice that she had come to understand meant he was proud of her in the particular way that does not diminish the person it is proud of. By the fall of 1875, the Kendrick Keene household had settled into a life that had the deep, particular satisfaction of something genuinely built, not achieved through luck or inheritance or the smoothed-out ease of privileged circumstance, but built day by day, choice by choice, from the cracked and difficult ground up. The property had expanded. In the third year, Levi had purchased an additional 40 acres to the north of the original Keene Ranch, bringing their combined landholding to over 300 acres, which was workable for both the cattle operation and the increasingly productive agricultural enterprise that Henrietta managed with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. They had added chickens, 24 now, and a second milk cow because one cow in a family of 6, counting William, was inadequate arithmetic. The stone line fence had been rebuilt and extended to properly mark the current boundaries, and they had built together a second outbuilding for storage and equipment, which was done correctly and without hurry and stood as solid as everything else they had put their hands to. Henrietta's agricultural records had, by now, attracted attention beyond the personal. A man from the State Agricultural Office in Topeka had written to her, forwarded through the Willowbend postmaster, asking if she would be willing to share her observations on drought-resistant varieties and soil management for poor clay-heavy land. She wrote back yes, and the correspondence that followed was intellectually satisfying in a way that reminded her of her father's Latin lessons and the pleasure of a mind working on something worth working on. Levi read her letters to the agricultural office with undisguised pride and also made specific suggestions, because he had 6 years of observation on his own land that she incorporated into her analysis, and they worked on the correspondence together at the kitchen table in the evenings the same way they worked on everything, as genuine partners in the fullest sense of the word. Clara came home for Christmas of 1875 with the glow of a person who has found her element. She was almost 14, and she was studying literature and mathematics and natural history and Latin, which delighted Henrietta in a way that was entirely personal. And she had written 3 essays for Mrs. Avery that Mrs. Avery had kept copies of, which was, in its way, a form of publication. She sat at Christmas dinner, which was the fullest the table had ever been, because Dorothea and the Calhoun family joined them and the Swensons came too, and Arne Swenson brought his fiddle, and William, who was now just over a year old and making increasingly determined attempts at locomotion, pulled himself up against the table leg and stood for 3 consecutive seconds while George counted them aloud with enormous intensity. Levi watched all of this from his chair at the head of the table, which had become his place over the years, and Henrietta watched him watch it, and she saw on his face the complete and settled happiness of a man who has everything he did not know for certain he would ever have, and who knows it and is grateful for it. She caught his eye across the table, and he held her gaze, and something passed between them that required no words, had never needed words, the silent language of two people who know each other with the thoroughness that only time and truth and daily proximity can build. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And then the Swenson fiddle started and the Christmas noise resumed, and William made his second 3-second stand, and everyone cheered. By the spring of 1876, the drought of the previous summer was memory, and the land was recovering with the resilience that had, over 3 years, ceased to surprise Henrietta. She had come to trust this land in the way you trust something you have tested thoroughly. She knew its moods and its limitations and its gifts, and she worked with all three. She was 35 years old in the spring of 1876, and she did not feel the weight of this number in any uncomfortable way. She felt the weight of it in the good sense, in the sense of something accumulated, a life that had content and direction and substance. She had her children, all 4 of them, thriving in their particular ways. She had the land that she had made into something. She had her correspondence with the Agricultural Office, which had recently resulted in a request to contribute to a state publication on homesteading practice. She had Levi, who was 34 and who she loved more. She found, with each season that passed, in the deepening way that love grows when it is tended honestly. She told him this in April, on an evening when the Kansas spring was doing its spectacular thing with the wildflowers, covering the flat ground in a riotous and improbable profusion of color that always seemed to be apologizing for the winter. They were walking the north fence line, which was a thing they did when the weather allowed and the children were occupied, just the 2 of them, walking and talking with the unhurried ease of people who know they have time. "I love you more now than I did a year ago," she said. "I find this interesting. I had assumed that love reached a kind of plateau, a point where it stopped growing and simply maintained." "And it has not," he said. "It has not," she confirmed. "It keeps expanding. I find new things to love about you with an inconvenient regularity." "Inconvenient," he repeated, with the warm amusement that lived just beneath the surface of his steadiness. "It is inconvenient," she said, "because I was already entirely committed, and the expansion is somewhat gratuitous at this point." He laughed fully and freely, and she had the thought she sometimes had about his laugh, that she had been given something rare, because Levi Keene's full, genuine laugh was not something he offered casually, and each time she produced it she felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who knows her own gifts. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and took both her hands and looked at her in the April light with an expression that was entirely serious and entirely warm at once. "Henrietta," he said, "I want to say something to you that I have never quite said in these exact words." "Say it," she said. "You are the finest person I have ever known," he said. "I do not mean that as a compliment to your virtues in the abstract. I mean that the specific combination of who you are, your mind, your honesty, your courage, your kindness, the way you love your children and this land and everything you decide to commit yourself to, it is the finest thing I have had the privilege of being near, and that I am grateful every single day that you were the one who filed on the land no one wanted and moved into the adjacent county." She looked at him for a long moment. "Levi Keene," she said, and her voice was steady because she had practiced steadiness too. "You are the best thing that ever happened to the Kendrick parcel." He kissed her in the middle of the wildflowers in the April Kansas afternoon, and the roan horse Samuel was visible in the distance, moving through the new spring grass, and somewhere behind them they could hear George's voice raised in argument with me about something entirely inconsequential, and the sound of it was the sound of her life, full and real and genuinely, completely hers. They walked back to the house hand in hand through the flowers, and she thought about the morning she had arrived here, 3 years ago now, with $112 and 3 children, and the deed to land no one had wanted. She thought about the land office clerk's barely concealed amusement, and the clay-hard soil, and the broken sod cutter, and the man she had found asleep against a fence post in the early morning. She thought about everything she had not known then that she knew now, about soil chemistry and hand pumps, and the right proportion of lime and sand and water for mortar, about Cyrus Aldridge and county surveyors and the names of judges, about what it felt like to be genuinely cold in a Kansas winter, and what it felt like to harvest corn that had no business growing in clay soil, but had decided to do it anyway. About what it felt like to be kissed at a doorway in the snow, and to dance in a long, low room lit by oil lamps, and to hold a new child while the man you love waits in the kitchen with his hands locked together. About what it felt like to be known, thoroughly and truly and generously, by another person. She looked at the limestone walls of her house as they came back to it through the flowers, and at the third room with its east-facing window, and at the outbuildings they had built together, and at the garden coming back in its spring green, and she felt the full, settled, completely closed weight of something finished and real, not finished in the sense of ending, but finished in the sense of built. The way a wall is finished when the last stone is in place, and the mortar has cured and you know it will hold. They were home. Both of them, for the first time she suspected, in either of their lives. Inside, Mee was at the kitchen table with her plant journal, drawing with the careful precision of a girl who sees what she looks at. George was at the door, having come back in from whatever argument with Mee had ended itself in the way George's arguments always ended, on a pivot toward something else that interested him more. William was in his corner, stacking wooden blocks with the intense concentration of a 14-month-old who has discovered physics and found it personally challenging. Clara, who had come home for the week from Dodge City, was in the east room with a book, her feet up on the windowsill, reading in the morning light exactly as her mother had imagined when they built it. Henrietta stood at the door of her house and looked at all of this, and Levi came to stand behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and they looked at it together. "We did well," she said. "We did," he agreed. She turned and looked up at him, and he was looking at her, not at the room, just at her, in the steady and entire way he always looked at her, as though she were the most interesting thing in any landscape she inhabited. "More children," she said, because she had been thinking about it and she saw no reason not to ask. He raised an eyebrow and something moved through his expression that was warm and amused and also entirely sincere. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "The house can hold it." "The house can hold it," he agreed. She took his hand and they stepped inside together, into the smell of coffee and pine pitch and the particular living warmth of a home that was full, and the door swung closed behind them on the wide and beautiful Kansas spring. The stone-lined fence still ran along the eastern edge of the property, visible from the kitchen window on clear days, each stone set in its place and weathered now to the gray gold of old limestone, permanent as anything this country offered. It was the first boundary and the last reminder, the line that had marked the beginning of everything, the edge she had stood at with her deed in hand before she knew what was on the other side of it. She knew now. She had known for quite some time. It had turned out to be everything.